This episode is brought to you by The Skeptical Buddha, The Tao of Science, my book, which is a thoughtful discourse on Eastern philosophy and how it helped birth ideas required for science and skepticism and the way it fell behind in the face of new evidence. This book discusses the long history of both philosophies as well as the tenets and variations within the varying sects, along with psychology and our own natural biases. It discusses how to counter our natural biases using science and the underlying concepts of meditation and mindfulness, a more complex understanding of how science operates than most of the public understands, and why it is the best tool we have to discover truth and reality, as well as philosophical ideas we might embrace as technology progresses. The material is packaged in a way that the average person can understand, with rich illustrations to draw the reader in and feel at peace. Welcome to After School Democracy, the podcast that attempts to fill in the gaps you almost certainly missed in school about politics, economics, and history. So, I'm back to responding to Whatifalthist. This time a very legitimate confusion he had that he said he clearly didn't understand and didn't try to claim he did, then went on a diatribe about rap culture and SJWs. I used to watch him because I felt he was pretty fair and balanced, but ignorant on certain parts of history, like we all are, and knew chunks of history well that I didn't. These past few videos have really gotten hard right, as he appears to have fallen in as a consultant to tech bros and drank their Kool-Aid. I have 3 more responses to correct some of his more insane claims, most of which I posted in the comments already, but this is one he was mostly humble with, and is a good general misconception among many. I will be breaking this up 1 per month because I don't want this channel to be just dunking on him. However, he is a great conduit in correcting misinformation, so many have, and I will continue to use at least 3 videos, but if he keeps going the track he's going, I'll be unsubscribing. I sometimes feel like instead of feminist studies and African American studies, it should be called equality studies or power structure studies or something ubiquitous, specifically because those terms often tend to deter students who need to learn them the most, that being white men. One of the biggest mysteries to so many white people is why and how ghettos in the US arose, and where urban black generational poverty and violence arose, many blaming it on the people themselves, or they must be inferior races, obviously, unaware that this was all created to benefit white people and black folks were completely screwed. Okay, so the reason why the breakdown of the urban black communities came from 2 factors. 1, as a method to maintain resilience in case we got nudged starting in the 50s, the US government spread out industries by subsidizing the crap out of rural regions and encouraging companies to set up shop in small towns instead of big cities. That caused a massive drop in urban manufacturing jobs. And number 2, the refrigerated truck and refrigeration in general. Meatpacking was always an urban job because they needed slaughter and to get their food out as soon as possible or it would spoil. That's what a large chunk of blacks who moved in the Great Migration did. With refrigerated trucks, meatpacking could now be done anywhere, and it was more expensive to bring cows in on trains than frozen meat. With these 2 factors, lower-skilled, good-paying urban jobs tanked. Thanks to redlining, making interest rates insanely high for blacks, they now lived in neighborhoods with no jobs, and all their savings sunk into housing, whose property values were now tanked. Moving with the factory was probably untenable because they'd have to go live in a white-heavy area, and a large number of blacks entering a rural white area could end up with many of them dead. Add to it all the plans by northern cities to classify black middle-class areas as ghettos so they could then snag the land for cheap and displace them. They often displaced them by giving them government housing or the projects that was inferior as opposed to the government housing given to mostly white veterans in the 1950s. They used this government housing as a way to claim that they were compensating blacks for not only kicking them off their land, but often as restitution for slavery. I made a video on how we could give restitution for redlining by letting blacks who should have been eligible at the time and their kids access to government housing and dirt cheap loans just like we did for white vets. For white people, if they got welfare, they were essentially handed it. But if a black family needed welfare, the man had to basically abandon the family and the welfare agent would do all sorts of tests, even sue the woman for welfare fraud if even a grown man's belt during midnight raids was found in the home, as they also intrusively monitor her sex life, and she only still got 1/3 of the welfare that whites got. This was only corrected in the 1970s, and once blacks started getting it, Reagan was able to then use it as a dog whistle, denigrating welfare in general that no one had an issue with till black people started getting it. It was originally a way for white single mothers to stay out of the workforce, so there were more good-paying jobs for men. But they didn't want to lose their domestic help, so it was denied to black mothers. It's often a huge reason why so many fathers were absent from their children's lives, and it became a cultural norm until this generation, when black men are the most involved with their children's lives than any other demographic. Add to this that the redlined areas always got the bulk of industrial pollution and waste, which dropped IQ and boosted violence, and you have a recipe for disaster. It wasn't until the late 90s, after the FDA started reducing these toxins, that the crime waves began to subside as poisoned young people began to age out of their crime-likely years, and the younger blacks with less poisons began replacing them. All these factors combined to ensure many blacks were just stuck in these new ghettos and projects, trapped in a cycle of poverty, unable to get out. Once these jobs started drying up in the urban areas, taxes from these areas started drying up too, to the point that these cities, like New York, literally abandoned these areas, giving them no police presence or public utilities like streetlights for that matter. Hip-hop music was actually created as a way to supplement the lack of access to traditional musical instruments in their schools, replacing it with sampling and spoken word street poets called rappers. Unlike what he seems to wrongly believe, this literally is the only time we defunded the police anywhere in the US, but also took literally every chance they had of bettering themselves at all away. Nixon coined the term benign neglect, which you can look into further, claiming that helping them out would just make them dependent. Add the crack epidemic in the 80s after nihilism became baked into the cultural mindset, as jobs were never coming back and everything was hopeless, and you got the American ghetto legacy. I would binge the C-SPAN lectures and history podcast where they go into college classrooms and you could hear history lectures, and that's how I learned most of this. Your diatribe about rap culture and SJWs and victim culture clearly shows you don't understand any of this, and I was oblivious to this until the last 5 years thanks to education by these SJWs. Acknowledging being a victim is essential to moving forward and healing, and much of black culture is a long collective trauma, and only now are getting to have something of a collective group therapy for. Victimhood mindset does stop people from not trying, but it's only a tiny minority that fall into it if you've been paying attention to the black protests and movements. Some, like the Black Panthers and Black Wall Street, trying to become self-sustaining only to get crushed by government or mobs of angry white people. Hopefully, this filled in the gap you have about the rise of ghettos and reduce some more of the blame that people have on blacks for not recovering from slavery fast enough. Every time they tried, the government or a white mob killed their ability to do anything for themselves, and everything they did was so much more expensive than it was for a white person. Like I said, my videos on easy reparations for vets that would also end the housing crisis is one you should watch if you have more curiosity on the issue. So as always, thank you all for watching this as a video or listening to this as a podcast, which I'm sure was completely uncontroversial to anyone, especially to the YouTube monetization team. So if you found this useful, please donate to my Patreon. Just a reminder that I'm Anubis2814 on YouTube, and I have almost 700 videos on my channel that I've made over the past 11 years on religion, science, psychology, and politics. Please go check them out, and if your site has the option, like, rate, review, and comment. A special thanks goes out to Kendall Copperberg, Mylon Mia, Ogrel, Elias Garcia Guevara, and Joe Taylor for their $10 or more Wapawet level donations. I'm always humbled by the fact that they find my work worth funding and worth driving me forward. Thank you all. Please consider donating to my work if you can, and thank you all for listening.